Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. This is Elizabeth Townsend-Gard, your host, and I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School and a faculty fellow at the A.B. Friedman School of Business at Tulane. And I just want to quilt. So Jessica Silbey joins us. She is a law professor, and she has written a book called The Eureka Myth. It's really interesting. I hope you like it.
Sure. My name is Jessica Silbey. I'm calling from Brookline, Massachusetts. I'm a professor of law at Northeastern University School of Law.
And you guys are doing really cool things there. We have to talk about that at some point. Don't you have a? Do you have a clinic now? Do you have an IP clinic?
Well, we have a new center, actually, that has a clinic attached to it. The center's called CLIC, the Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity.
Oh, that's really
cool. And
our
IP center is called the CoLab.
Oh, yeah. Right. So interesting. Okay, so we have one question that everybody gets, which is, it's so funny because your book, you have all these questions you ask everybody. I'm like, oh, I should have done that. We're like way into the project. I'm like, we needed to talk earlier. This is not good. Anyway, so our question is, what's your first memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life?
Oh, my mother had a sewing machine that she kept up in the attic, which was a big playroom for us growing up, and it made a very familiar and to me sort of very homey sound. You know, the sound, the sewing machine going.
I love the sound. Yeah.
And she took 16 years to finish her dissertation as a grad student.
Nice.
She had kids in the middle. And as a form of procrastination, she taught herself how to sew.
I love it.
Really good.
What was her dissertation on?
Oh, my mom's a sociologist. So I think her dissertation was on actually police, regulation of police actually in the 1970s. So very early stage stuff. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that's really interesting. So, and have you ever done any sewing or quilting, or is that just never anything that you connected to?
No, I have actually. So, I never formally was taught. I sort of did, I snuck up there and used her machine without her knowing, or maybe she did know. But, when I traveled, after college, I bought a couple batiks when I was traveling and living in the former Soviet Union, and I made quilts. Using the batiks as the center, and they were, I did that. They're just, I don't know if there's probably a name for them, but they're the striped quilts. So there are lots of it. It's just a square pattern.
I love it. That's great. That's very cool. Well, you are an intellectual property professor, and you wrote a book fairly recently called The Eureka Myth. And we were supposed to do I think we were supposed to do some sort of panel on it that didn't, I don't know, someplace that didn't. We were thinking about it. There was a whole bunch of people who wanted to talk about your book, but now we're going to talk about it here. Tell me, so for those that, tell us how did this book come about, and what is this book about? Right.
So the book was published in 2015, and it was a 10-year project almost, and it came from a frustration that I experienced as an IP lawyer and then later as an IP professor, that the law we would teach through the cases seemed to not reflect the experience of creators and inventors who I had worked with as lawyers and who I knew in my life. And so I wanted to learn more about how intellectual property actually works for people who do it every day. And I became obsessed with the lack of evidence, grounded evidence to justify the rules that were in our statutes, or in very one-sided evidence, I thought. That was my hypothesis anyway. Yeah. And so I set out to do a qualitative empirical study to interview as many people as I could in the time I had to figure out how intellectual property works and doesn't work for them. That is, whether it facilitates the good work that they want to do in arts and science.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And your work is important because of sort of what you're finding. So in many ways, my work is kind of, there's this trend, I guess, with IP that we're all seeing we're seeing it from different angles, but seeing similar situations where we're in the classroom and we're teaching and we're telling them all that, they're learning all of these rules, like case law, but for like general public, like rules. And then we're like, yeah, but they don't really apply, right? So like there's this kind of weirdness on one side of it of like, right. Yeah, well, it's not quite like that. And then the other side of it, and I think what you were getting with in your book, which I like so much, is if this is about creativity, if these laws are supposed to incentivize creativity, is it? And sort of what is the role of law in creativity? So our projects at Tulane have also been looking at it from different aspects, and that's what the quilting project's about, is really understanding, immersing, and trying to really understand what role law plays in all of this crazy world,
Right, and part also is understanding law in more complex ways than just the rules that are in the statutes or that judges apply. I mean, law is understood by people in various ways. And so I was not only trying to figure out how the formal rule, the law on the book, so to speak, are understood by or affect everyday creators and innovators, but I was also trying to make an argument that IP law is made and constituted by the practices of everyday people, and that we should care about those everyday practices. So, for example, if copyright, the idea of what copyright is or why it's important to certain sculptors, for example, has much more to do with how their work is curated and kept looking well in the public space. If that's what they think copyright should be doing or is doing for them, it's what they try to get it to do through their contracts. Whether or not formal law does or not, I think we should care if we care about public art. That's what sculptors care about.
Like what? Yeah. So right. So I keep saying that. Like, when does it matter? Like, what do people care about? Like, obvious. Sometimes it's economics, but sometimes it's how they feel about their art. And that's what you found as well, right? Right.
And it's also often about, so one of the things that the qualitative method or the interview method allows you to do is to identify more nuances and variation within communities and practices. So law can be very one-sided and be binary. Copyright is either an incentive or not an incentive. And what you do is when I interviewed photographers and I interviewed sculptors and authors and biologists and chemists and engineers. So cool. And so within each of those groups, you can identify related things that they care about, but also different things. I mean, so you identify variations. And that, of course, is just, for me, I find that so interesting. It's really studying human behavior and collaboration. And so one of the things that they care about, other than making a living, they all care about making a living. They don't often care about maximizing their returns, which I thought was an important thing.
Yeah.
It's not about aggregating money, like collecting it all. It's making enough so that they can continue to work and continue to have some control over their lives. So a form of autonomy. They also care, and they often care about the relationships that the work enables. And sometimes if the work frustrates relationships, that is upsetting. So back to the sculptor example, if the inability to control the public display of a work breaks relationships with other entities, commissioning entities or agents, it's frustrating to them that these contractual obligations or the inability to have some sort of mechanism that says, yes, every 2 years we're going to clean the sculpture and I'm going to be consulted when you do that. That breaks relationships down and it makes it harder for them to conceptualize doing work in the future. So it's relationship building as well as making a living, for example, and just controlling the work in public space.
Yeah, interesting. So how did you choose the people you interviewed?
So that's a great question. So there are, I sent out hundreds and hundreds of letters to people that I identified as both sort of famous people who had already made a reputation in the field, and people who were emerging. So I wanted to spread the sample between people who are at the beginning of their career and sort of thinking about how their future might evolve, and people who are already established. And I thought that certification was important because they might care differently about IP.
Yeah.
So I sent out a bunch of letters. I was confined because I didn't have a ton of money for this project geographically, and so I only did it in the Northeast, and I wanted to do face-to-face interviews because in the field doing these kind of ethnographic work, you get more truthful and more complex responses when you can have a face-to-face conversation. So I wanted to have face-to-face that controlled the geography, and I did a massive letter campaign. And then once I had a couple interviews, 4 or 5, then I did snowball sampling, which means I asked the people I was interviewing for suggestions, which usually was a more useful way of getting more people because references often respond more readily.
If you have a connection,
but the important part of that is to make sure I was getting people who were maybe on different side issues. So if I had someone who was an open source software person and he made recommendations for people, I wanted to make sure that the recommendations, and I was clear about this, that maybe it was somebody who he perceived as having different ideas than he did. And I didn't want to keep interviewing like-minded people. Yeah. So the snowball sampling has that concern that you want to keep doing. So I interviewed over 50 people for the project, and that took me about 4 years to get all the data transcribed and then coded and then analyzed.
Because you transcribed and coded the data. What were you coding? That seems very difficult. What were you coding for?
So the transcription was done by a professional transcriber. So I wrote all the interviews. They were about 2 hours each, and then they were transcribed. So what happens is you get this, these long transcripts between 40 and 70 pages, and these are all accounts from the person. So a novelist would be. Think about one person I interviewed who was a children's book author, like a tween person. She wrote dozens and dozens of books over her life in these series for kids, and I sat in her apartment, her house, and for 2.5 hours we talked about her life as a book author. And then that gets transcribed, and then I put all the transcripts into a software system that I can then search just for words. For example, if I want to see how many times does a person mention this, for example. But the best way to analyze is not as a series of texts, the way we might analyze a canon of somebody's work, but I code it. And the way you code in qualitative methods is you maybe put together 50 or 60 keywords that you think are conceptually important, but also have arrived inductively through the experience of interviewing. And then you attach those words to part of the transcript. And they can overlap. So here's somebody talking about both money and a partnership, so those two words would be attached. Or here's a person talking about a bad experience. I had a label called abuse when they felt abused by the system, for example, and that would be attached to maybe patents, or maybe it was a patent litigation that they were really unhappy about. And so once you attach all the codes to all the transcripts, you can then search the transcripts by those codes, and you can sort them differently. And the software is smart enough so that it can suggest relationships as well as suggest different ways of connecting the different parts. And so it's an iterative analysis of the data that is very rigorous. And what happens is you come in with ideas of what you think you heard and what you think people told you and what the patterns are. And through this process of close iterative analysis, things emerge that surprise you, like things I wasn't even expecting to see, or I didn't even understand could be related.
So give me an example of what you thought. Give me an example of one of those.
Sure. So because my own I would admit biases about how I thought IP was misaligned with everyday creators and innovators, I was expecting to hear and I thought I did, at least I think I was paying attention more to these stories about how people freely share their work. Yeah. That is, they give it away, or they allow other people to use it, and that's a joy to them. And I remember those stories a lot. But when I dug into the data, and I had different categories of different kinds of sharing. So there were different ways that people share their work, and share is now a more complex term. Sometimes they do give it away for free, no strings attached. But a lot of the time they attach strings when they do it. And so thinking or better understanding what those strings are when they share their work was was informative to me.
That's really
so
interesting.
the chapter of my book called Distribution has 5 different categories of how they distribute their work. They're less than control than intellectual property would, but they're 5 nuanced ways of sharing that are just more complex. And I was surprised. So certain strings, like for example, I will give it to you, but you have to attach my name, and I don't want you working with this person.
Yeah,
for example, like that.
That's really interesting.
Or, So I was forced to pay attention to the differences. And one of the other surprises is I thought I was going to see a big difference in how people managed that distribution based on whether you were an artist, for example, or you were a scientist. I had a general idea. And that was not true at all.
Really?
Yes, it was not true. The scientists and the inventors and the authors and the artists actually, I did not see or hear a difference. And when I pushed the data to find a difference, there wasn't any. Moreover, there wasn't much of a difference between the business people, sort of the lawyers and the CEOs and the people who founded companies, or the book publishers, for example, and the artists and the inventors themselves. I was expecting to see intermediaries and companies having different ideas about what kind of distribution they wanted to control and what they didn't. And I didn't see that. And really I will say every time I talk about this book to audiences, if I don't mention that somebody always asks, well, of course, companies care more about exclusive control. And it turns out not to be true, at least not from my data.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I have various hypotheses in the book, and of course the limitations to this kind of qualitative work is I can only generate hypotheses. I cannot prove it. But one of the things that people say to me all the time who are running companies is, listen, I'm a person and I run this company and I care a lot about the people who surround me. Like I often care more about the people I surround myself with than whether I'm going to be filthy rich at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And so my relationships with people, if you're going to ask me to hire is what I care more about at the end of the day, it's whether I'm working with people I want to work with.
Yeah.
Not whether when I die, I have $7 million in the bank.
Yeah.
And so the companies are made of people, and they're not abstract entities. And so, and of course when I interview them, they talk like people.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's really interesting. All right, so I have many thoughts we have way too much to do. Hold on, I just lost my place. So what I wanted to, oops, crap, I'm doing it on Kindle, and I'm at the book, and I can't get to the part I wanted to read because it's now being weird. I totally don't use Kindle enough to actually, see, that's why we're not live.
Yeah, of course.
It's not hard-hitting journalism.
Yeah, I have little paper tabs all over my book. That's how I find things.
So I wanted to go first to the conclusion because I love. I wanted to read a paragraph. So I thought maybe we'd do this. The second paragraph in the conclusion, I'd read it, and then we could talk a little bit about sort of as you've talked about some of it already, but maybe this as a beginning, and then I wanted to have a few questions.
That's what I was thinking of when I was just mentioning that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Okay, so it's weird to read your book to you. So artists and scientists seek quality and stability in their work, not abundance. And you said, to me, this is unremarkable. So we've talked about that before. So quality and stability in their work. Quality meaning what? And what is... How did they define quality and stability?
So I'll answer stability first because that's easier. So they want to be able to continue doing what they're doing, and they want to have some control over their time and their workflow.
Yeah.
So stability means being able to plan and I mean, autonomy is a big word, but
Yeah.
they want control over their life.
Yeah.
And
We
the
see
and
that-
the work. Okay,
we
they
see
don't want
that
to have to.
we see that in quilting. Part of it is that it's a really strange industry. It's a $5 billion industry with 10 to 15 million quilters. But those that are doing it are still struggling to make a living, which I think is really interesting. So what I'm seeing is quality and stability have a lot to do with also the economics of it, that they're it's interesting. So stability is both,
of course. Money is not unimportant. In fact, money is super important for autonomy. But so they don't. I mean, right. But I do think quality is a different variable.
Quality is. You think it is artistic?
Often people can make really good work. Yeah, people can make good work under stressful conditions.
Hugely, and we see. The other thing I saw, and I'm curious about your thoughts about it, is quality isn't about being a professional or being a hobbyist or being whatever. It kind of, quality is quality, and sort of how you feel about your art is how you feel about your art. It's not whether you make your living from it or not, your full living from it.
Right. So I think quality is a harder thing, and it's much more subjective, and it was much more varied.
Interesting.
So I guess answering the question would depend on which community you wanted me to talk about. But and one example would be that for photographers, for example, although they embrace amateur photography all the time. I mean, they want other people to learn the skill and to be photographers, and the democratization of the field is exciting to them because it makes them even more relevant than ever. They're the kind of photography that circulates, that's high quality, is accurate, authentic, and often lit in a way that highlights a story that they're trying to tell.
Really interesting.
Maybe there's some ambiguity in it, but it comes from there's a story that the photographer is telling that emerges from the photograph. So for each,
that's really interesting. So let me ask you a question about that. Did the photographers then feel like did they see a difference between being a professional photographer? Was it based on quality in terms of what makes you a professional photographer?
No. Professional photographers will say that there could be quality work coming out of amateurs. But one of the things that differentiated for photographers professional work from amateur work is an ethics of photography and a sense of basically control. A lot of the photographers, and this is where I find this a follow-on project that I'm doing on digital photography and professional photography so intriguing, is that photographers care a lot about controlling how their photographs circulate.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to control what the image means in culture.
Oh, that's interesting.
That it is a representation of a story that they have gone out and made through their camera and their work. And when it gets contextualized or it gets photoshopped or it put a new caption on it or it gets put on someone's blog and it sort of misinterprets it, that appears to degrade the attention they have paid to making the work. And that and they think that one difference between professionals and amateur photographers today is that ethic of control.
Interesting.
Now, not all artists and authors describe that kind of difference between professional work and amateur work.
So what I'm finding is that the professional quilters, particularly those that see themselves as artists in art quilts and other things, they have this kind of notion that if they put out an art quilt online, they expect people to respect it and not make their own versions of it. But if they put out a pattern of one of the quilts, then that's sort of a indication to them that other people can make that quilt. That's kind of which seems a little bit like they've got this kind of sense of this is not to be reproduced. This is a particular thing versus the ones that they've created patterns for. And so they struggle a lot because that's not a division that people necessarily if there's a whole bunch of pictures on Pinterest, the average person's not going to know that,
So how the photographers describe that problem and that phenomenon, the problem is that they think if if amateur photographers were mentored and trained, and there were organizations and systems where there used to be that brought you up to teach you how you treat other people's work, how you develop as a photographer, that those norms of borrowing and influence, which they embrace, and the norms of not taking the whole thing, which they also want to perpetuate, would be kept through a mentoring and education process.
That's really interesting.
Because of the democratization of the activity, because it's just so much easier to sort of quote unquote be a photographer, those norms of the practice are not inculcated.
So
now, I would just have an example in the photography world. A lot of professional photographers have assistants, and the assistants learn the styles and the techniques of the well-regarded photographer. And that's part of the process. Like teaching you how to light a shoot in a certain way that may be a signature style is something that they embrace. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. And when you go out and you are your own photographer, you can take part of that, or that I expect that to be. But don't make photos that look exactly like mine.
Yeah.
You know?
That's
okay, so I think actually a lot. So even though where the line is drawn may be a little different in every creative space, and how one manages that line may be different depending on how you share the information. I do think I'm finding anyway that a lot of creators care about that. They want to share skills and concepts and resources, but the whole thing that has been made is theirs.
Yeah,
you know,
it's interesting. Yeah, I'm finding the same. That seems to sort of that's the kind of situation. That's what I'm finding as well. The other thing I find that's really
one of the
go ahead.
I just want to say one of the things that, if we bring it back to law, is, and law as a grounded practice. So how do those rules get instantiated? So if that's something that quilters care a lot about, and they're
very
working
stressed
to make. So how does that work? And how do you do it so that it's sticky, so that people buy into it, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's hard.
Yeah, and I think for this culture, there's still a huge they have tons and tons of quilt guilds and quilt shops, and I think it's like what our project is really thinking about or my project is, that's where the norming is happening, and that's where customs are. So if you can have conversations in the quilt guilds and in the shops about what this is, and better understand the relationship between what people do and the law and custom, and like, you know, what's being a good citizen, and that they have these conversations, that will help the ecosystem. That's kind of the idea.
I mean, one of the things that I've also been finding is that the practice of individualized contracting or bargaining or informal agreements, people rely on that a lot. And of course, that's a very contrary to intellectual property idea. Yeah. So when you send out an invoice that says, here's my invoice for the headshots I did for your firm, $1,500, you know, payable, blah blah blah, and you can have them. You know, I don't want to see you again. I don't want them anymore. A lot of photographers will say, I don't care how you use them anymore. Just take the photographs. That's not my art, for example. But if I send an invoice for use of this particular piece in this situation only, and I want and it's only for this thing. It's $1,500, and if you want it for some other purposes, let's talk later. Yeah, you know, that's their way of informally, basically licensing. Yeah, you know, right. They from their own practices and their own preferences, they are sort of mimicking some of the things that exist in law, but they're doing them in much more personable, sort of one-to-one ways.
It's interesting. Really interesting. One of the things that I'm really we have a whole paragraph to get through, and we're so not going to get there. So, all right. Okay. But one of the things that I'm really interested in is, and it's kind of related to this, is how far you can go with a particular work, and it's kind of this question of, you know, at least in quilting, what happens is, okay, you put a pattern out or you make fabric, And like there's an implied license that if you buy fabric or you buy a pattern that the person's going to make the pattern, right? So that's kind of part of the whole thing. Or why
right.
would you buy it? But then there's a question of how much you can restrict what people do with it. So can they make it a bunch of times? Can they put it on Etsy? Can they sell it? Like, all these kinds of questions come up. And how far does the pattern... So like how much can you license that pattern? What are you licensing? What are you selling them? And what role does first sale doctrine play in that? And I'm not totally, like, I've asked this question to a lot of people and it's not totally clear,
Well, I mean, they don't have a concept when they sell it, like they don't have an expectation, or there's so much variation that you don't know what the rule
Well,
is?
I mean, I think that it was fine until Etsy came about. Right. So people would buy a pattern and they'd make it. And even if they sold it at their church.
The controlled copying was by virtue of our physical brick and mortar world.
That's right.
The moment that we had an internet distribution system, the norms were, all of a sudden norms changed pretty rapidly and we couldn't figure out whether we were accepting them or we were fighting against them. Right. So,
so like if you put for personal use only on a pattern, what does personal use mean, and how far does that, like, what can they do with the pattern they bought? That becomes a question. And then from my side of it, is that pattern have any actual originality? Is it just is it a common pattern that they just made directions for that it doesn't have a lot of copyright in the first place? So it becomes a little more complicated as to what is a pattern exactly. That's the first part. And then the second part is we all know...
they don't see all these opportunities for somebody to have paid me for my money. I mean, sometimes they do, and sometimes they get mad about it.
Yeah.
But there's just in no way are they going after all these people for the money. Like it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, a little frustrated because they wish that it just didn't circulate so promiscuously.
Yeah.
But at the same time. This is the world we live in, and understand that it's just a fact of our life.
That's right.
It's not okay, but I want to be clear. It's not that abuse is a fact of our life. It's not that piracy is a fact of our life, because they don't see a lot of these uses as things that they would have paid for.
Yeah.
Right. They're new conditions of our material reality.
Right.
And so what do they do now?
Exactly.
What do they do is they adjust, and they haven't adjusted their expectations of what quality would be. If anything, I think they're doubling down on it, the photographers anyway, and they're more vocal, and they don't lock down their stuff either. I find that so interesting. So I don't know what your quilters do, but the photographers I've interviewed have not. They don't register their copyrights more frequently.
I know, what's that about? It's so weird, right?
They don't link. So they don't do any of those things, which
so
I
weird.
Found is super interesting. But they are more vocal, and when they do work with other people, they try to insist on mutuality, this agreement, when they can. And so they're in some ways they're returning to a sense of, listen, you should care like I care, that this stuff doesn't happen in a way that degrades the art.
That's so interesting, because I get that. I've heard that a bunch, and it always surprised me, like the way that the pattern, and there's lots of parts of quilting, lots and lots, inventions, all kinds of stuff, but the pattern makers, I hear them say, like please respect the fact that this is how I earn my living. And it's a personal appeal to our moral compass, not...
But it's not only moral. Let's just be honest. It's a personal appeal to distributive justice.
Yeah.
Like I make a living doing this,
That's
and I need to recoup, right? And so it's not only like just respect me. It's this is how I make a living.
That's right. Exactly. And sometimes they're upset that there are kind of people. Well, they get upset because the fabric companies now make free patterns and just have them out there. So even though the fabric companies are paying the artists to make the patterns, the public's not seeing that, and so they feel very frustrated by that it sort of devalues their...
The analogy in the photography study is to stock photo, to free and royalty-free licensing.
Yeah, that it's
the low-end competition, the low-end competition that the internet has enabled, which is really good for consumers. I mean, let's be honest, it's really good for consumers, and it really democratizes the space. is also, it has a perception that the work you're doing now is less valuable.
That's right. That's really
worth
interesting.
less. And so what are the photographers doing are they're compensating. Many of them are compensating, and some would say that's exactly what competition is supposed to do, by emphasizing what skills they bring that stock stuff doesn't, or quality they bring that the stock doesn't.
Yeah. I see that too. That's really interesting. Okay, we're going to go into number 2 because we could be on this one like for hours, and it's so interesting, right? Okay, when interviewees focus on finances, they do so to enable more art or science or to form relationships, not to collect money for its own sake. For me, this is inspiring. All right, so that's really interesting too, that it's the work they're doing, that they want to earn a living, but the work is what matters. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, I see that too.
In fact, the money is a means to an end, and the end is their work. I find it so inspiring. And in fact, I think these are not just the famous artists, right? These are the people who aren't famous. They just want to do what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Lawyers or business managers?
Very honorable.
Yeah, very honorable. And really cool. I mean, we live in a really interesting time. It's very, maybe it's always that way, but I think that because of the internet, it calls into question why you're doing it, you know what I mean? There's a kind of, like, where we live is very kind of, like, I don't know, there's an authenticness to it, and there's a sense of, like, well, you have to sort of, I don't know. I just think it's cool. We don't take things for, you kind of have to think through your life, I guess, at this point. Okay. Lawyers or business managers confirm that their clients and creative or innovative partners define themselves by their work. This is unremarkable. So that, okay, that one makes sense. The objects they produce or the services they render are not everyday work goals, despite their likely monetization or distribution to develop fans and consumers. Work itself is the goal. They enjoy doing the work, meeting the challenges, thinking about and achieving the next step with cultivated skills and interests. This is inspiring. So talk about that one. I like that one a lot.
So when you ask them, one of the things I ask them is what counts as good work for you? Like, what are your goals within your field? And many of them talked about being challenged. They identify things they want to be able to do, and then they see something else that really inspires them, and they have to figure out, how do I do that and incorporate that into my work, for example? Or you're a bench scientist at a pharmaceutical company. You might have an explicit goal of figuring out how these molecules interact, for example, for the purposes of this treatment. But you have this new equipment that you want to be able to use, and you want to make it more efficient, and you want to bring more women onto your team, for example. So there are these little details about everyday life that propel them forward, that are wrapped up in the activities that they do every day. That is work that accumulates to the big thing. So, I mean, I don't know, in quilting, eventually you make a giant quilt that will be on somebody's bed or hang on a wall, for example. But the picking out the pattern, sourcing the fabric, figuring out what the best way to cut it is, who you're working with when you're doing it, what space you're doing it in. Is there a better space to do it in? These are preoccupations that sound so banal.
It's all the
but
bits.
They matter so much to everybody, And you think about, like, what does my workspace look like?
Right.
And so when you talk to people about how do you do good work, they talk about these details, the time and the space of doing it, and they talk about it in exciting ways. Like, it's an embodiment of who they are. Yeah,
it is. It is. It totally is. It's really interesting. I keep saying, quilting, what's interesting about quilting is that it takes up a lot of space. So you get a lot of people, mostly women, mostly empty nesters. Sometimes they have babies, but who are taking over bits of their house. And so... or they are professionals who have a studio, or they've started whatever it is. But the space of quilting becomes really important because there's so much stuff that's involved. And there's even Facebook groups that are devoted to showing us your space and telling us about your space. It's very interesting. And again, for me...
So this is where...
Go ahead. It feels very much like Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, kind of feminist sort of, this is where I work, this is what I need kind of thing.
Right. So this is where, another way to think about this is, you could say who you are is what you do. Your identity is what you do every day. But so it's so much, the boundaries of the person and the artist go beyond my knees and my elbows and my hands, right? They are my desk and the wall, what's on my walls, and who enters my room, like was it my dog or, my children, and like who we are as people is fluid. And one of the things that I think that for the creators and innovators, that is particularly obvious when you talk to them about how they do good work every day. Like and when they talk about what is bad work. So when I'm doing these interviews, you always have to look for contrast because you're trying to draw distinctions, figuring out where the categories end and new categories begin. And so when you ask them, what is bad work? They'll say, well, when I'm sharing the space and the guy is like, making this tea that smells so terrible, like I can't concentrate,
Yeah.
You're talking different kinds of like being able to, but then you think being able to concentrate, what does that mean to them? How is that manifested? Or, so what is a good space? What does that mean? And so they, and one of the things is, does intellectual property facilitate that?
No, nothing about that. Right.
In no way, right? That's a very different, and in many ways I've returned to sort of very old fashioned views of labor history and rules about workers' rights, for example, that I think creators and innovators care a lot about. Fair wages, for example,
we got a ton of that.
Clean living conditions.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's a lot of conversation about sort of the devaluing of labor in quilts because quilting takes so much time. And people aren't paying for that labor. That the question is like, if you really wanted to know how much this quilt costs. So there's a kind of sense of like people buy quilts, but that also that it's beyond the cost of the labor. It's something else.
Yeah.
So
everything like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's totally true. Money does not correlate to the value of the work.
Yeah.
Right? And so back to how some of these artists and scientists talk about distributing their work in different, more complicated ways. Some people will give their really, really valuable stuff away for free if it's to the right person.
Yeah. Right.
Have it. I want you to have it.
Yeah.
Other people will charge a huge fee because, God, I'm parting with this bothers me at some level, So the money is not correlated to any objective measure of value.
Yeah. And we also get with quilting, we're seeing that in quilting completely. Same thing. The other thing we have is a huge amount of charity quilting. So we get a ton of people, a ton of charity quilting, which is completely the opposite. Like they are buying the materials and they are making it and they are sending it off into the world. And that to me seems incredibly heroic as well. That's part of this world.
Yeah, and we do that with our labor all the time, right?
Yeah.
We do that with our labor. We volunteer. We work in our communities.
Right.
And so if we think about one of the things that is defining the artists and inventors that I spend so much time with is that they are not defining themselves by these exclusive entitlements that can be traded in very economic ways.
Yeah.
It's much more fluid and it's much more human. They talk a lot about their work. Even the scientists talk about their work in terms of family relationships. My baby or my, it's like these people are like my family. And we don't sell those people.
Right. We don't sell those people. Right. We don't sell the babies.
So the economic analysis of intellectual property and the work that's produced for intellectual property is really misaligned with the kind of value and quality and the rules that they want instantiated.
So interesting, isn't it?
Work.
You think about how much time it takes a scientist to do something, and that's not going to be equated. Maybe once in a while somebody will have a patent that's like extremely whatever, but that's not motivating. That can't be motivating them because it's not going to be. That's not going to be the norm.
No. No, not at all. Not at all.
All right.
Right. They work when they feel rewarded.
Yeah.
And they feel like the work they're doing is going to be, they hope it's going to be out in the world doing good most of the time, that it's going to be they're respected.
I like it. All right. These people work to be free and free to pursue what interests them.
Yeah.
That's
right.
good.
That seems basic.
Yeah, that seems basic. Okay, if they are lucky, as the many artists, scientists, and business folks I interviewed feel they are, their work is what interests them. If they can work under favorable conditions, their work is a form of freedom. Inspiring. So that by the act of working, by the act of their passion, they feel they are themselves, they are who they want to be. Is that sort of what you find what you're seeing with that? Did you quit on me?
I think all people do that. But
Yeah.
This meeting is being recorded.
They describe that. I mean, being free.
Yeah.
In the zone, in the flow,
Right.
doing it. That's,
Yeah.
That part, I will say, one of the things of doing this kind of work also is that I didn't discover that. I think, but many other psychologists and sociologists who studied creativity and innovation over the years, whether it's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi or Teresa Audley or David Pink or something like Daniel Pink, they've all said that too. So my work confirmed this aspect of it. So that's good. It's always good. That means that the data was robust.
Yeah. Also, we're seeing that like people feel like it's for them. Quilting is healing. Quilting is a quiet space, healing, therapy. Even like when I have headaches, I go and it takes me to a different place. Meditation. I get a lot of that kind of.
I did not hear that as much. I will admit.
That's interesting. All right, I have more questions.
Sense.
Yeah. Okay, we have like 10 minutes. So hold on, we're way past half an hour, but someone's coming at 10. So so we talked about the importance of space already. We also the beginnings. So the one question I do have is this patterns and right statements. So this is a little off topic from your book, but as your IP hat on, do you feel like how do we first of all, patterns. So one of the things I'm sort of struggling with right now, this is now just a therapy session with me, is we have this concept that recipes, directions are not copyrightable. That's part of what we teach the students, right? That it's useful articles, like the objects could be the art can be protected, but not directions, right? Not the recipe for cookies. But what I'm seeing in the work that what I'm seeing is that the pattern is the art, right? It's more like the pattern is the expression, even if it says cut for triangles or whatever it is. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that.
The instructions for the pattern, the instructions for the pattern, or the pattern itself? I guess I don't know enough about.
Okay, so if you have a piece of art, you have whatever piece of art, and then you have the instructions on how to make exactly that art.
Yeah. Okay.
It seems like the instructions are the art.
Yeah, this reminds me of Baker versus Selden, that famous old case about double column bookkeeping. Yeah, when the only way to do the thing is to follow the instructions, and the result may be a visual expression. Yeah, you can't wrap up the instructions. Yeah,
but I think it's the opposite. So I think it's the opposite of that. That's what's freaking me out, because Baker v. Selden was a useful system. This isn't useful. Like making a giraffe in a certain way that is very artistic, there's no usefulness to that. So I think that it's kind of...
Is there a usefulness to cookies?
Yeah, I think there is.
I mean, a recipe... Really?
I think there is. So that's what I was talking to Chris Reed about this. I think there is a usefulness to cookies. It is a useful article. It is sustenance. It's a thing that we eat, which is different than...
I live with a chef, and he would say that the beautiful cake that he has made could be art too. Yeah. I mean, he wouldn't claim that he can prevent other people from copying it. He
I don't know.
But why can't it be both?
Because the question then becomes what's protectable, right? So I think that if you don't make the instructions, those instructions protectable, you're also not making the art protectable.
Right, but what form of protection are quilters seeking for the pattern? So this also reminds me of software.
Yeah,
right?
It is very software-y. That's exactly that's the analogy.
Yeah. I mean, I would think that instructions by person A, when followed by persons B through F, the result is different every time.
Yeah, but what if it isn't? So I think that's the part that's interesting. So, okay, if they follow it perfectly, it should be a copy of the original work. If they alter it,
fabric, and it's different. I mean, isn't it? It's different.
I mean, it could be, and
tensions and.
Right. So let's say the first version, you do it exactly as they told you to. So you get exact copy. But then the next one, I'm going to change that into a blue or whatever. You've altered it just a little bit. So you're creating a derivative work of the original pattern. It seems like you're still creating that artwork, that just because you're told how to do the artwork doesn't mean that the instructions themselves, that the instructions have got to be the art.
So this reminds me, when I teach copyright, everyone has seen a picture of the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and it's all often from the same perspective. And it's not that anyone has copied anybody else; it's that everyone stands at the same place and takes the same picture.
Right.
It's not actually a copyright infringement. We've all just done the same
independent
basic
creation.
thing.
Right. It's independent creation. That's
but
right.
It's right, and
exactly.
So with your patterns. Could you protect the made quilt, but not the instructions?
I mean, I think that's what's happening normally, right? So I just think and then you've got the other added problem.
And so then the question is, why does that help quilters? So I can protect the picture of the Eiffel Tower that is mine, but anyone else can go and make a same picture. Right. So I think that may not make me feel better, but it's just a.
Well, I mean, I think that it's a little bit different. How I would differentiate that is if I go to the object of the Eiffel Tower and I take a picture, we all take our independent pictures. That's fine. Here, I've created something completely unique. I've told you how to make it. And it seems like the process of making that unique thing, like it would be if the Eiffel Tower was still protected and then you gave out the directions.
This is the example. Yeah. This example, Ansel Adams has this famous picture of Yosemite, the Half Dome, and you can't copy his picture. You can't make a copy of his picture without infringing his copyright. But I can go to Half Dome and try to take that same picture. Okay, I have your quilt and your beautiful quilt.
Yeah.
If I copy your quilt, if I make your exact quilt, I've infringed your copyright. And the question is whether the instructions to make a quilt that I've generated are themselves copied. I guess I'm just not sure.
Yeah, and maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, when you think about it that way. Like if you make the thing, then in the act of making it, once it's done, you've infringed my work.
You infringed the thing that you're protecting,
and maybe that's and maybe that's. I mean, I think maybe.
I mean, the thing that's funny about this is and this is what the photographers do. I want to teach you how to make this beautiful thing.
That's right.
But I don't want.
But don't sell it.
I want you to pay.
Right. Exactly. Don't sell it.
Am I allowed to? Am I allowed to sell the quilt if I make it? I mean,
I don't know.
So when photographers license their photographs, here is they're licensing under certain conditions. It's pretty explicitly. So what is the condition? What are the terms when I license a pattern? You're allowed to copy the pattern. That is, I can photocopy the pattern and give it to somebody else. Maybe you can't, but
sometimes no, you can't. You can't do that. You can't. They really don't want you to do that. That they really don't want.
Right?
That.
They don't want you to do that because. But why don't they want you to do it?
Because that's their economics. They want every single person to buy their own pattern. So they don't want any copying. For personal use, like sometimes they'll even say like you can copy page 5. This
is because the economic model is based on the thing that is unprotectable.
Right. Well,
the thing that they make, which has so much value, but you can't. Right. You can't make money selling quilts, but you might be able to make money selling patterns, but the patterns themselves may be unprotectable.
Right. Exactly.
So this is just right. And so the question is, should law care about that? Should we care about that? If we care about enabling quilters to continue to make patterns,
we do. That's right.
Maybe, yeah.
That's right. That's right. And the system itself has to care, so that you get the situation of, well, it's your whole thing about the distributive justice. Look, I'm spending 100 hours making this pattern, so that you can do it as a hobbyist. Please buy the pattern, and then each of your friends need to buy the pattern because I'm only making $5 off of each pattern, and I need to pay my rent.
back to my some of the findings in the book is a lot of people do it even when they don't make any money.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
The law, I mean, if we're being formalist about the law, I mean, the law doesn't protect everything that has value.
Right.
It never does.
Never does.
You know, and it shouldn't.
Yeah.
There's no if value then right concept in IP.
Right.
And a lot of the times what we say formally in IP, although I'm always skeptical about it, is if you don't need it as an incentive, we shouldn't put it in the law because because the default should be that it's open. Intellectual property is an exception to the public domain, not the other way around.
And it
so
was
then the question
forever.
is, would people,
right.
And yeah, it has forever. So then the question is, you know, why should we, if the patterns still get generated with this leaky system of protectability, why would we strengthen it? I don't know why we would. I mean, that's
well, I mean,
what the photographers are saying is, I'm not.
Yeah,
I don't want to take the internet away. I like the internet.
Yeah.
You know, I just wish that people would treat my stuff a little bit differently. But I'm just not sure that they. I mean, I'll say one of the things that's a little bit more controversial about the things that I'm thinking about is this is about unions and bargaining power and about
totally
the huge intermediaries versus the individual workers.
Hugely. That's right.
You know, I mean, photographers hate Pinterest.
Right.
And Google, they think all this money is going to these huge intermediaries off their backs, and like they're not getting a piece of it.
That's right.
But that's not an intellectual property problem.
No,
that's not an intellectual property problem. That is a distribution of wealth problem.
That's right. That's right.
And
it's
so
happening
I
to
don't feel like going
quilters,
to IP is the right place to go.
Yeah, I can't wait to read your stuff on photographers. When you get finished with that article, will you come back? Because I think photographers and quilters are they've got a lot of similarity. And I would love to chat more with you about that. It's really, really interesting. Well, we've talked for an hour. Because we totally can't help it.
We could have talked a lot longer.
I know. Will you come back and chat with us? Because I think people are going to just completely adore you. And I think the work that you do is so interesting and so cool. And I think my project is here because of your project. And so many of us in IP are working on these kinds of projects. And you really do set a standard that we all have to, a qualitative standard that's
great.
really great.
I couldn't be happier that the work that I did for so long is spawning all these other great works.
Hugely, right? It's great. It's amazing.
It's perfect.
It really is. And I think really important to the field because if we don't do this work, it's very disconnected. The law and what we teach and what's actually happening is very it's complicated. That's what I always keep saying. It's complicated. People ask me a question, I'm like, well, it's complicated. You know?
I know, but at the end of the day, it's about people's lives.
Yeah, totally. And our world and who we are, like what we are in this world. You know. Yeah. Communities that we create. Yeah, for sure. Well, I would love to come back. Awesome.
I would love to.
Cool. Well, so when you get a chance, just let me know when you want to talk about the other article, and I would love it. Let's just spend a whole hour talking about that article and what you're finding with that. I think it would be so great.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
Okay.
Would you like to review this before I post it, or are you okay with it being posted?
Yeah. Just send me a link so I can listen too.
Awesome. Fantastic. All right. Thanks so much.
All right.
Bye, have a good day.
You too.
So you've been listening to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. And I'm Elizabeth Townsend-Gard. If you like this podcast, keep listening. Also, we have a Facebook group. Come join us. We talk about a lot of things. We also have an Instagram account. And of course, most importantly, I really hope you get a chance to quilt today.